Evening, when the barracks doors closed and the guards' footsteps faded, Amara gathered them. Kira's wide, fearful eyes searched hers. Sefu sat silent, his face grave, his patience waiting for her words. Daniel leaned against the wall, battered but defiant, his fists clenched. Amara stood in the center of them all, the data pads heavy in her hands, her heart heavier still. She looked at each of them in turn, her voice steady, her words slow, each one carrying the weight of everything they had lost. "We were taken as children," she said, "but we are not children anymore. The Dominion thinks we will walk into their war and die for them. But tonight, we choose our own war. Tonight, we rise." The silence that followed was electric, alive with fear, with hope, with the stirring of something that had been buried too long. For the first time in 10 years, the air inside Varix 9 felt different. It felt like the beginning, the breakout. From Varix 9 was not a single explosion of rebellion, but a chain of moments, each as fragile and dangerous as glass underfoot. For weeks after the sympathetic guard had slipped Amara the maps, she had studied them in secret, memorizing every shift rotation, every blind corridor, every vent that might carry them into the Dominion's lifeless veins. She waited for the right night, the right convergence of schedules, the right storm of courage and desperation. When it came, she moved with a calmness that belied the terror hammering in her chest. The power generators were their lifeline, and their weakness. Daniel and 2 others crawled through vent shafts, slick with condensation, their breaths shallow as they clutched makeshift tools scavenged from years of labor. Kira worked silently behind Amara, her hands trembling but steady as she rewired circuits with knowledge stolen from years of forced engineering drills. Sefu waited with a quiet intensity near the main junction, his eyes scanning the shadows, ready to distract or shield. When the power core flickered and then went dark, alarms wailed across the compound. Chaos descended. The barracks erupted as doors sealed, guards shouting orders in the Dominion tongue. Amara gave the signal, her voice a harsh whisper. Now, they surged forward, breaking into the weapons cache. For the first time, human hands wrapped around Dominion rifles, not as slaves, but as thieves, reclaiming fire. The weapons thrummed, with alien energy, humming against their palms, too heavy and strange, but deadly, all the same. The first shots rang out in stuttering beams of light, cutting through the armored guards. Amara moved like a shadow, precise and steady, her eyes on survival. Daniel was fire unleashed, his roar carrying as he cut through the first line of soldiers, reckless and furious. Blood and ash filled the air, human and alien alike, falling in the corridors of the prison that had shaped them. Not all made it. One of the youngest, Tay, no more than 17, was caught by a plasma blast, his body folding to the ground. Another was dragged back by a soldier's claw, her screams ending in silence. Each loss cut Amara deeper, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Every step forward meant the chance of life. The chance of proving their existence had not been for nothing. By the time they reached the hangar, the compound was ablaze, alarms echoing like a funeral dirge. The stolen ship waited, small but fast, built for transport and patrol. They stormed its ramp, Daniel covering their retreat with wild, unrelenting fire, until Amara dragged him inside. As the doors sealed and the engines roared, Varix 9 shrank behind them. Smoke and flames rising from the prison that had been their cage. They were free. For the first time in 10 years, they were free. But freedom was not the end. It was the beginning of a war they had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. With the maps clutched like scripture, they struck at supply depots, ambushed patrol ships, and vanished into asteroid belts before the Dominion could catch them. Each raid sent ripples through the galaxy. Whispers spread in hushed, disbelieving tones. The forgotten human captives are alive, and they are fighting back. For the first time since Earth's humiliation, the name human carried something other than defeat. To those enslaved under Dominion rule, it carried hope. To the Dominion, it carried irritation that sharpened into fear. Yet with each strike, the fractures among them grew. Daniel thrived in fire. His vengeance was his compass. Every raid another chance to bleed the Dominion dry, to slaughter their captors without mercy. He argued for bolder attacks, for striking at officers, for burning worlds in retribution. His voice carried the rage of every child stolen, every parent slaughtered. They made us weapons, he spat one night, his fists slamming against the metal table in their stolen ship. Then let's be weapons. Let's make them afraid. Amara's gaze met his, weary but unbroken. If all we do is kill, we're no better than them, she said, her voice low. We fight to live, not just to die dragging them with us. Daniel's laughter was sharp, bitter. You still dream of freedom, Amara, but freedom is a lie. In their galaxy, there's only survival, and survival means burning them all. The silence that followed carried the weight of years of unspoken grief between them. Kira's struggle was quieter, but no less fierce. Nights after raids, she would sit alone, her hands shaking as she scrubbed at blood that would not wash away. Her voice, once the gentle compass of their group, trembled with doubt. We are children, Amara, she whispered one night when the ship's hum was the only sound. Children pretending to fight an empire. I dream of their faces, the ones we kill. I hear their voices. What if we can't do this? What if we can't win? Amara knelt beside her, gripping her trembling hands. We don't have to win the galaxy, Kira. We just have to live long enough to prove we were never theirs. But Amara's own heart echoed with Kira's fear. She too wondered if they were anything more than sparks destined to burn out in the endless dark. The doubt sharpened into something more dangerous when they captured their first Dominion officer. A captain, wounded and snarling, chained to the bulkhead of their stolen ship. His mandibles clicked in disdain as Amara questioned him. You think you're different? He rasped through the translator. You think your rebellion makes you righteous, but I have seen it before. Conquerors fall, and the conquered take their place. Power does not liberate. It corrupts. You will become us. His words burrowed into Amara's mind, festering. She wanted to dismiss them as manipulation, but the fear already lived inside her. Daniel's hunger for vengeance, her own coldness, the thrill she felt when a raid succeeded. Was she already becoming what she hated? She stared at the officers, glinting eyes, and felt, for the first time, the abyss beneath her feet. Yet she could not let her people see her falter. Each raid required her steadiness, her ability to stand between Daniel's fury and Kira's despair, to anchor them with something greater. She told herself it was survival. She told herself it was her mother's voice guiding her still. But, in the quiet moments, she feared that the Dominion officer was right. That victory might only mean new chains forged in human hands. After one particularly brutal raid, when Dominion blood still streaked their stolen ship and exhaustion weighed on every shoulder, Amara stood alone at the viewport. The galaxy stretched before her, stars like cold fire scattered across an infinite dark. She pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. The memories of her village surged, the sea, the yam fields, her mother's voice calling her name through fire. Her lips moved, barely a whisper, but the words carried the weight of her entire being. Survive, live, remember who you are. The stars did not answer, but she felt something steady in her chest. The war ahead would be long, but they would not be forgotten. The fleets gathered in silence before the storm, a patchwork of stolen Dominion warships, rusted freighters refitted with weapons, and vessels gifted by alien defectors who had long suffered under the Threx Dominion's chains. From orbit, Verex Prime burned like a jewel, its surface covered in glittering spires and armored citadels, the very heart of the empire that had enslaved them for decades. Amara stood at the helm of the Sparrow's Cry, her eyes steady but her heart unsteady, the weight of every soul who had died to reach this day pressing against her chest. Around her, fighters readied weapons, engines hummed, and the rebels whispered in dozens of languages, united by a single truth. The moment had come to end their masters. When the first salvo struck, the skies ignited. Dominion orbital cannons thundered, ripping apart the leading human ships, but the rebels pressed on with fury carved from generations of pain. Amara's commands cut through the chaos with calm precision, her voice steady over the coms. Shields forward, flank left. Break their line. The humans moved like water, flowing around Dominion formations that once would have crushed them. They had learned. They had bled. Now they struck back with a knowledge the Dominion could not erase. Explosions painted the black void in red and gold, wreckage spinning into the gravity well of the planet below. The war had reached the enemy's home. On the surface, the capital city of Threxos shook under bombardment. Streets cracked, statues of Dominion rulers toppled, and terrified citizens fled into bunkers as human troops stormed forward. Rifles scavenged from dead guards clutched in their hands. Daniel was at the front, fire in his eyes, unyielding in his rage. Where Amara commanded, Daniel fought, leading charges with reckless abandon, cutting through the Dominion elite soldiers as if every strike of his blade was vengeance carried from their burning village. He moved like a force of nature, unstoppable, and the rebels followed him as though he were the embodiment of justice itself. But Amara saw it, the madness behind his eyes, the hunger for destruction that no victory would ever satisfy. When they reached the central spire, the Dominion's seat of power, chaos reigned. Human rebels and alien allies surged inside, fighting room by room, floor by floor, until the great hall of the High Command lay within reach. It was here Daniel's plan revealed itself. Amid the fighting, he broke from the main force, dragging a device from the shadows of a stolen pack, a Dominion warhead, reprogrammed its yield strong enough to burn the capital to ash. Amara's blood ran cold as she saw him racing for the spire's core reactor. She screamed his name over the coms, but he ignored her, his eyes alight with a fanatic fire. "This is the only way," he growled when she caught up, breath ragged, the warhead clutched to his chest like a child. "They killed our parents. They burned our home. We make them feel it. Every single one of them." Amara stepped between him and the reactor, her body trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of what she had to do. "No, Daniel, if we slaughter them, all civilians, children, we are no better than they were. Do you think Mama's last words meant this? She told us to survive, to live, to remember who we are. If you press that trigger, you erase her." Daniel's face twisted, torn between love and rage, between memory and vengeance. He raised the detonator, his voice breaking. "And if I don't, every life we lost means nothing." His hand shook. His fury demanded release. Amara's heart shattered, because she knew there was no reasoning left, only choice. The siblings clashed in a storm of grief and violence. Daniel swung with wild desperation, years of anger pouring into each blow. Amara blocked, parried, struck, back, tears streaking her face, even as she fought. This was not just war. This was the breaking of blood, the tearing apart of family. Every strike echoed with their shared past the fields of their village, their mother's scream, their years in captivity. He was her brother, but he had become the embodiment of vengeance she could no longer allow to lead. In a final brutal moment, Amara disarmed him, the detonator clattering across the floor. She pinned him to the ground, her own body bruised and bleeding, and whispered through her sobs, "I love you, but I will not let you destroy us." His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then filled again with pain as he went limp beneath her grip. Defeated, the rebels surged into the high command chamber behind her, dragging Dominion generals in chains. Amara, bloodied and shaking, forced herself to stand tall. She ordered the generals to their knees, in the very square, where they had once paraded enslaved children. Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting across the galaxy, the Dominion's leaders bowing before the humans. They had tried to erase. Around her, the rebels cheered, but Amara did not smile. Her victory tasted of ash. Daniel, bound and silent, turned his face away. This was not triumph without scars, it was survival, painful and imperfect. Yet it was survival nonetheless, as the sun rose over the smoking ruins of Threxos. Amara looked out over the city and whispered the words that had carried her across a decade of suffering. Survive. Live. Remember who you are. For the first time in years, the words felt less like a burden and more like a promise that despite all the blood, all the tears, humanity had endured. And in enduring, they had won. The fires of Verex, Prime's fall, still glowed in the night sky even weeks later as the Dominion's chains unraveled across the galaxy. The once mighty empire that had enslaved generations was fractured, its fleets shattered, its rulers humiliated. For the first time since their abduction, humanity was no longer the prey. But victory brought with it a heavy shadow. Amara walked among the ruins, not as a conqueror, but as a reluctant guardian of the fragile peace that followed. Everywhere she went, the freed captives hailed her as the woman who refused to let the Dominion erase their names. Yet in her chest, where the roar of triumph should have lived, there was only silence and a weight she could not set down. She bore the burden of the dead. She remembered their faces, children who had grown into warriors and then into ash on battlefields, friends who had whispered old earth lullabies into the darkness only to vanish in flashes of plasma fire. She carried the guilt of nearly losing Daniel forever to his own rage, of raising her voice against him with fists and blood in a battle that scarred her heart as much as her body. They had survived together for so long, and in that final moment, they had nearly destroyed each other. The galaxy saw her as a savior. She saw herself as a sister who had almost failed. Daniel lived, but he lived in shadows, confined within the liberated capital. His body healed, but his spirit smoldered like coals beneath ash. He did not forgive her for stopping him, and he did not forgive himself for what he had tried to do. When Amara visited him, she found not the boy who once laughed by the river bank, nor the young man who stood by her side in every raid, but someone hollowed out by the weight of vengeance denied. He would sit in silence, eyes distant, and when he spoke at all, it was only to remind her that justice had been stolen. Still, she came, again and again, because no wound between them could sever blood and memory. Their bond was scarred, but it endured, like the earth itself, battered, burned, but not erased. Kira emerged from the war changed in another way. Where once she doubted humanity's strength, now she believed in it with the fervor of faith. The girl who trembled in the re-education chambers had become a teacher, her voice carrying the forbidden songs and languages that had once been whispered in secret. On alien worlds, she gathered children, both human and freed species, and taught them Earth's stories of rivers and forests, of lullabies and legends. They listened with wide eyes as if hearing magic, though it was only memory given shape. To Kira, survival was no longer enough. It was remembrance that mattered, and she swore that no child, human or alien, would ever again grow up believing their history could be erased. Sefu, the steady rock who had guided them when they were too young to lead themselves, helped plant the seeds of what would come next. He counseled patience, urged restraint, reminded them that liberation without rebuilding would turn to chaos. His voice, calm as a farmer's rhythm, guided the first councils of the free worlds. Under his advice, humanity did not take thrones or crowns. They chose instead to build alliances, to share strength rather than hoard it. Where the Dominion had ruled through fear, the survivors of Earth stood as a reminder that no empire lasts forever, that chains can be broken and that memory cannot be erased by decree. When the war finally loosened its grip, they returned to the soil of Earth. The village that had once burned was little more than ruins, but they walked its fields with hands ready to heal. Together, they dug into the scarred earth and planted crops again, seeds pressed into the dirt with hands that had carried rifles and bled for freedom. For many, it was the first time they had touched Earth's soil since they were children. For Amara, it was a circle completed, the fire that had consumed her mother's body, now giving way to growth. The ashes birthing green shoots that swayed gently in the wind. As the seasons turned, the galaxy listened to their voices. Humanity, once thought broken, now became the echo that stirred other worlds to rise. They were not conquerors, they were not emperors. They were survivors who had chosen to live without chains and to give others the same chance. In every council, in every alliance, the story of Verix9 was told, how children stolen in the night had grown into the ones who broke an empire. The Dominion's generals knelt in chains, but humanity's true victory was not their surrender. It was the memory that endured. On the anniversary of their liberation, Amara stood once more in the field where her mother had died. The ground that had been blackened was now fertile, rows of green stretching toward the horizon. She pressed her palm to the soil, feeling its life, and let the memories come of fire, of loss, of whispers in the dark, of battles fought and scars carried. Around her, children laughed, their voices rising into the air without fear of silence. She closed her eyes, hearing in them the voice of the mother who had told her once, in the burning night, to survive. Her lips moved with a whisper only the wind could carry. We survived, we lived, and they will always remember who we are. The words did not tremble, for they were not a plea. They were a truth, carved in memory and planted in soil. The galaxy would remember, because humanity had refused to forget, and in that remembrance, they had found not just survival, but the power to endure beyond chains, beyond fire, beyond even loss. The years stretched on like echoes of grief, woven into new life. The scars of the Dominion War faded from burned stone and shattered villages, yet the memory of the night the sky first tore open above the Oak family's fields never left Amara's heart. She had carried those screams through war, through rebellion, through victory and loss, and now, at last, the ground was whole again. Crops grew where ash had once fallen, children ran where soldiers had once dragged them in chains, and laughter rang out against a horizon that once smelled of smoke and blood. At the center of the village stood a statue wrought not of kings or warriors but of children, their hands clasped together, their faces carved not in triumph but in defiance. In their gaze lingered the truth that had carried them through ruin, that survival was not conquest, that freedom was not cruelty, that humanity was not measured in the blood it could spill, but in the voices it could raise together. It was a monument to those who had been stolen and to those who had never returned, a promise in stone that they would never be forgotten. Often came to the statue at dawn when the air was soft and the world seemed new again. Her body bore the weariness of battles long past, and her eyes still carried shadows of fire, but her voice had never wavered. She read aloud from her journal. Sometimes words she had begun to write on Verix9, when freedom seemed impossible. Now her words were carried by the wind to the rebuilt streets, where children chased one another not in fear but in joy. And she wondered if her mother could hear her, if that voice shouted into the flames, had found its way across time and stars to witness what had been built from ruin. They tried to wipe out a village. Her voice carried low, steady yet unbreakable. What they didn't know is that villages grow into nations, nations grow into voices, and voices can shake an empire. The people listened, not because she demanded but because they remembered, because each of them bore the same fire, the same history, the same relentless refusal to vanish. And in that shared remembering, humanity's strength had become unshakable far away on Verix Prime. Once the Dominion's throne world, a new city thrived, where once only obedience and chains had been forged. Markets bustled with the colors of countless Worlds' voices of alien children, learning human songs, rose into the air. Towers rebuilt from shattered palaces carried banners of every liberated people. Yet at the center hung one flag alone, stitched by trembling hands long ago, a patchwork of torn cloth burned at its edges, but whole again, the emblem of a human village that had refused to die. The first seed of defiance, sown in blood and smoke, Amara, stood in the village square. Where once her mother had screamed her last words, flames had licked the sky here, and she had been only a child, ripped away from the soil that fed her ancestors. Now she stood tall, a woman who had carried her people from chains to stars. The fields stretched green around her, vibrant and alive. She knelt, pressed her hand into the dirt, and felt the pulse of life that had outlived empires. She closed her eyes and whispered to the soil, to the memory of her mother, to every lost soul who had carried them here. We survived, we lived, and they will always remember who we are. Above the fields, above the statue, above the voices of children, a banner fluttered in the wind, stitched from scraps of cloth saved from that night long ago. And as it rippled across the horizon, it told the galaxy a truth that no dominion, number, empire, no conqueror could ever erase humanity. Endured humanity, remembered humanity had risen, not as conquerors, but as keepers of memory. And in that quiet, unshakable triumph, the stars themselves seemed to bow.